let's start just by time. So sort of give an overview of where we are. So this unit that we are currently in, it's about cells in general. We started off with a section about biochemistry. The molecules that make up all cells. Then we talked about cells, cell organelles, their function. We finished up with that. And then we moved into this section, which is about cell processes, about the different processes that take place within living cells that help them maintain homeostasis and provide for them to stay alive. So we talked about osmosis and diffusion and transport. So now we're moving on from that. So there's a few more cell processes that we'll talk about. We're going to start this week with photosynthesis. Next week we'll get into respiration, cellular respiration. Then we'll go into cell division from there, and that will finish up this section for us. So our focus this week is on photosynthesis. So just to get us started here, this is an interesting organism. This is a sea slug. So it's an animal. It's a mollusk. Lives in the ocean. And this specific type of sea slug has an interesting means of providing itself with nutrition. It mostly eats, it's an herbivore. So it eats like algae and kelp and things like that. However, one thing that this sea slug can do is when it consumes algae and digests them, it actually keeps their chloroplast. And it stores them inside the cells of its digestive system. And basically steals the chloroplast from these algae. And this sea slug becomes photosynthetic. It doesn't need to eat for months at a time because in its cells it's held these chloroplasts that it obtained from the algae that it ate. And it can basically, they provide the glucose it needs, the energy it needs to survive when they're exposed to sunlight and have carbon dioxide, so it actually steals chloroplast from other organisms. This is the only animal. There's other protists and other organisms that are known to do this, but this is the only animal that scientists have discovered that can actually do this, steal the chloroplast from another organism. So it's kind of interesting. So chloroplasts are these inside, this is a plant, these are plant cells, and inside what you see are chloroplasts, small organelles, where photosynthesis takes place. So we're going to get into the details of photosynthesis in this unit. So I know in 7th grade we talked about sort of the equation for photosynthesis. We talked about sort of the basics. You guys gave me that in the question of the day. Well, we're going to start to get into some more detail now about sort of how actually does a plant cell, a chloroplast, take these simple inorganic compounds like carbon dioxide, water, and using sunlight, how is it able to then transform those things into glucose? We'll go over some of the detail of that process. So today we'll talk a little bit about leaves and pigments and things like that, and then we'll start getting into the details tomorrow. So first off, photosynthesis, the basics that you already learned. Photosynthesis is sort of the basis of all food webs. All organisms rely on the sun, either directly or indirectly. So autotrophs, they get their nutrients from making glucose through photosynthesis. Even heterotrophs, the organisms they consume, okay, you could trace back the source of that energy back to the sun. Also, photosynthesis, we learned, as we talked about the evolution of life on Earth, we learned that there was no oxygen, or very little oxygen in the atmosphere until photosynthesis evolved. And then photosynthetic bacteria produced oxygen built up in the atmosphere. So the basic idea of photosynthesis, organisms converting light energy into a different type of enzyme, chemical bond energy of glucose, a glucose molecule. It's a photochemical reaction, a chemical reaction that requires light in order to take place. So we know that typically we think of plants as being green, and leaves as green, and chloroplast as green. Why are they green? Because chloroplast is what? Why is chloroplast green? No. A related word to chloroplast? Chlorophyll. So chloroplast, or chloroplast is the organelle. Inside of it, it has a large amount of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a molecule. It's a protein, basically, that is able to absorb sunlight. It's called a pigment. And chlorophyll is one of the pigments that is found in the chloroplast. There's others. So chlorophyll is the one that's most abundant. There's actually several types of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll A, B, C, D. There's more than that. And a pigment is basically a molecule that can absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflects other wavelengths of light. So when we look at these leaves of these plants over here that somehow survived over the winter break, even though I never came in, they have chlorophyll in them. That's why their leaves look green. But there are other plants as well, okay, like this plant, as its leaves are sort of purple. There's some green in there, but mostly purple. It has other pigments dominating the leaves of this plant versus these plants. So there's more than just chlorophyll that's absorbing energy from the sun. There are also pigments called carotenes. Carotenes are orange-colored pigments. Carotenes are what give carrots their color. It's squash and orange peels in nature. Most orange colors come from this molecule, carotene. But carotene is also present in leaves of green plants, but we typically don't see it. There are other yellow pigments, like xanthophyll. That's a yellowish pigment. It's what makes bananas yellow. It's also present in green leaves of plants, often though it's dominated by the chlorophyll, which is more abundant. Or even red pigments, like anthocyanin. So when do these other pigments sort of start to become obvious to us, especially where we live, when we see it? That's the fall. Fall. So in the fall, in autumn, in our climate, days are getting shorter. Okay, there's less light, less time of daylight, less direct sunlight. And so some plants have evolved the adaptation of losing their leaves in the fall, throughout the winter, and then growing them back in the spring. Okay, so those are called deciduous plants, and drop their leaves. And that's an adaptation, because maintaining living leaves takes a fair amount of energy, and there's relatively limited amounts of sunlight in our climate in the winter. And so their adaptation is drop the leaves, conserve energy, and then grow them again in the springtime once light starts to become more available. And so that process, the chlorophyll, when the leaves are getting ready to drop, the chlorophyll sort of breaks down first. And so the green color of the leaves sort of fades away. But the underlying pigments, like the carotenes and xanthophylls, they start to become more obvious to us. The leaves start to turn yellow, okay, or red, or orange. Now, eventually, those pigments typically die off as well and break down, and the leaves just brown and dead in the fall. But in the fall, our leaves change color as the chlorophyll breaks down, exposing the other pigments that are sort of underneath. We can actually see these pigments. If you take some leaves of a plant, sort of grind them up and dissolve them in a liquid, you can do what's called chromatography. This is a strip of chromatography paper. Basically what you do is you put some of the ground up plant leaves at the bottom of this paper, and then you suspend it vertically in a solvent, which sort of soaks up this chromatography paper. And as it soaks up the chromatography paper, it takes that plant leaf extract with it. But what happens is certain parts of that extract separate out according to the properties of the molecules. And you can start to distinguish the different pigments, like chlorophyll A, B, and xanthophyll, and keratin. They separate out on the paper, and then you can see them in those different areas. So you can separate the pigments and see them. Now, these different pigments absorb light at different wavelengths. So what do you know about sunlight, white light? What it actually is it? I mean, there is ultraviolet radiation coming from the sunlight. What else is there? What is white light is actually composed of all of the wavelengths of light combined. You use a prism. Have you ever seen a prism? Yeah. It's a glass, triangular piece of glass. Okay? And white light is actually made up of all of the colors of the spectrum. All of the wavelengths combined make white light. Okay? We can see those wavelengths here from blue all the way to red. And certain pigments absorb in different parts of the spectrum. So for example, chlorophyll A, one type of chlorophyll, it absorbs in this blue area quite a bit, and up here in the orangish area. Okay? Whereas chlorophyll B absorbs more of these towards the greener end, and also some of the more yellowish end. Okay? The carotenoids absorb over here. Okay? And another type of chlorophyll absorbs high up in the spectrum, the high wavelengths. So these different pigments can absorb different wavelengths of light to sort of maximize photosynthesis. Where is the least amount of light absorbed? At what wavelengths? Yeah, in this area here. Which makes sense because when you look at these leaves, what color do they appear? Green. So what does it mean if something appears green? As white light is hitting those green leaves, it's reflecting green. What is it doing to the other colors? Absorbing them. And so that's why these leaves appear green to us, because they're reflecting most of the wavelengths in that green area. So, would it be, would you want to use a green light bulb to grow plants? No. Yeah. No. Because what is green is not absorbed by any pigment. Okay? The green is mainly reflective, so you do not grow plants very well using the green light. You could use other types of light. Yeah. You could use a red light or a blue light. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the chloroplast in the leaves. So chloroplast is an organelle. It's a large organelle surrounded by a double membrane layer. And this is where photosynthesis takes place. You look more closely at a chloroplast. It has, I don't know, I call them poker chips. It looks like a stack of poker chips that are inside these chloroplasts. Those individual sort of chips are the thylakoids. It's a membrane-bound compartment within the chloroplast. And they're found in stacks that are called grana. And then there's a sort of fluid surrounding them inside of the chloroplast that's called the stroma. And these different structures that are within the chloroplast play different roles in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a complex process that has several parts to it. And certain parts happen in different areas of the chloroplast. This diagram, things look nice and neat. Under the microscope, they're not quite as clear. This is an electron microscope image of a chloroplast. Okay? And what you see are, the grana appears these dark areas. The stroma is sort of this grayish area. You also see what's inside when chloroplasts are making large amounts of glucose, sometimes they store that excess glucose in these starch granules. We know that starch is a polymer of glucose. And so they can form starch that stores up that glucose. So it's later glucose. All right, so you're going to have to flip ahead. I rearranged the order of our notes a bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about leaves, and tomorrow we'll be doing a lab in which you're going to look at leaves and slides that show leaves. So a leaf is adapted to photosynthesis. The shape of a leaf, it's flat, it has a large surface area facing upward, absorbing as much sunlight as possible. There are other structures within the leaf that allow it to get the materials needed for photosynthesis. So if we look at this cross section as if we're looking into the leaf, this would be the top of the leaf, this would be the bottom of the leaf. If we start here, the outermost layer on both the top and bottom of the leaf is a waxy substance called the cuticle. And it covers both surfaces of the leaf usually. What do you think its purpose is? Why would there be a waxy substance covering most of the leaf? Sort of, but not so much protected from water. No, because it has to do with water, however. It's not really membrane, it's just a waxy coating, but it's not to prevent water from going in. It's to keep water in the leaf. It's to reduce the amount of water that's lost through evaporation. If this cuticle were not there, a significant amount of water might evaporate through the gaps in these or between the cells, and the plant might dry out relatively quickly. So this cuticle helps keep it waterproof so that it doesn't dry out. The middle, so then below the cuticle are these thin, flattened cells. That's called the epidermis. Do we have an epidermis? Yes. What is it? What is our epidermis? Yeah, it's our skin. So this is sort of like the skin of the leaf, the outermost layer, these flattened layers of cells. Most photosynthesis does not happen in those epidermal layers. They sort of allow the sunlight to come through. Then we have the middle of the leaf. It's called the mesophyll. Meso means middle. And so that's this section here. And there's two types of mesophyll. There's the palisade layer of the mesophyll, which is up here. And then there's the spongy layer of mesophyll that's below it. So when you look at them, you can see the differences. The palisade layer, the cells are sort of stacked relatively close together. They're oriented sort of vertically. They have lots of chloroplast in them because this palisade layer is where most photosynthesis of the leaf takes place. Okay, sunlight comes into the leaf, travels through the cuticle and the epidermis, and hits the chloroplast in this palisade layer. The spongy layer has less cells. They're sort of roundish in shape, and what you'll see is there's lots of gaps, air spaces. Can anyone take a guess as to why there would be, what's the usefulness of having these air spaces within them? Dan? Close, but not oxygen, carbon dioxide. So this provides a way for carbon dioxide to get to the chloroplasts that are in these cells. How does it actually get in? But what about this waxy layer? Doesn't that seal it up? It also seals it from gases, but is there another way when you look at the diagram? Yeah, these stomates, these stoma. Well, this is continuous. You know what I mean? It's just a section. So if we look at the bottom layer of this leaf, we see that there are some areas, some gaps. They're called the stoma or stomates or stomata, and that's an opening. And this is the opening where carbon dioxide can come into the leaf to reach the chloroplast to provide them with the carbon dioxide they need for photosynthesis. Now, on each side of that opening are specialized cells called guard cells. Guard cells are able to open and close this opening. So they can sort of seal it shut sometimes or open it up at other times. And we'll talk about when that happens. So that's sort of the structure of the leaf. There also, it's not shown on this diagram, but there are also, do you know when you look at a leaf, the veins of a leaf? What do you think those veins of the leaf do? They transport them. What do they transport? They do, one part of it transports sugars and water. Because the water for a plant comes through the roots, is transported through the stem to the leaves through those veins. Here's another cross-section, and this just gives us sort of a summary of the things I talked about. So the cuticle, the layer that seals the leaf, prevents water loss. The epidermis also helps prevent water loss and protects the leaves. It's on the upper and lower surface of these long, sort of flattened cells. The palisade layer that's tightly packed, where most photosynthesis happens, with many chloroplasts in those cells. It's not shown here, but the veins of a leaf, we call that vascular tissue, is made of two things, phloem and xylem. The phloem is the tissue that carries the sugars, generally away from the leaves to the other parts of the plant. And the xylem is the vascular tissue that carries the water and minerals out to the leaves to provide the chloroplast with water. The spongy layer helps allow gas to come in, like carbon dioxide. And the stomates on the bottom, they are the openings that allow gases to come in, and the guard cells on each side open and close. They control the size of those openings. So let's talk a little bit about the guard cells and the stomata and see how they work. So why, if this is how carbon dioxide gets into the leaf, why would they close? Maybe. When would that be? When would they not need carbon dioxide any longer? Fall. Not time of the year. What time of day? At nighttime, right? At nighttime, photosynthesis is not taking place. Therefore, carbon dioxide isn't really needed. But why would they close? When these are open, not only do they allow carbon dioxide in, but they also allow water out. And so, if it's a very hot, dry day, the guard cells might close to prevent excess water loss so that the plant doesn't dry out. And so that's an adaptation to preventing water loss, those guard cells closing depending on the conditions. And so the way that these guard cells work is they work by osmosis. So if we look at this situation, this would be in the daytime. So you have the two guard cells. Okay? And they have chloroplast in them, these guard cells. So during the daytime, they can make glucose, which builds up inside of the guard cells, that makes them hypertonic, okay, to the cells around them. And therefore, what happens to hypertonic cells? And back to osmosis. They swell. And so when they swell up, they open. They don't explode.
Wait, how would they close?
Because they're sort of inflating and expanding. And then in the nighttime, when they stop making glucose, they become hypotonic. They lose water, and then they deflate, closing up that gap so that carbon dioxide can't get in and water can't evaporate. And so this is an adaptation allowing these cells to open and close the opening to prevent water loss. Certain plants have also other adaptations. For example, plants live in very dry conditions. They open up the stomates at nighttime, okay, when it's cooler and when water loss is not as much of an issue. And so different plants have different, some plants have more of these openings on the top of the leaf than the bottom. Okay, for example, plants that are floating plants in the water, they need to get carbon dioxide from the top because the bottom's in the water. So they have these openings on the top. So different plants have adapted to different conditions related to those stomates. All right, we'll stop there for today. Any questions about leaves or stomates? Tomorrow we'll start getting into more details about photosynthesis.